I was meeting John Landis at his office because he had become a friend of mine, and there he introduced me to Deborah Hill. And Deborah said that she was producing a movie for Dino De Laurentiis, and she thought that maybe I should have a look at it. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, it's The Dead Zone. Would you be interested in doing that? And I immediately said yes. I guess the timing was just right. I had just done Videodrome, which was a very extreme, intense, kind of a horror fantasy. And I was feeling that I wasn't ready yet to write another original script, which Videodrome was. And suddenly the idea of doing a movie based on someone else's work, with someone else writing the script, had an immediate appeal to me.
Stephen King's a good writer. I think it's always about real people and sort of mundane situations. And then he introduces some wild, extraterrestrial, or otherwise bizarre thing, and people react to it in a way that they really would. I think that's what it is it draws you in because it could be you in the story.
The Dead Zone would prove to be, for its time, the best-selling novel that Steve King had, and the first of his novels to go to the top of the New York Times hardcover bestseller list. But when it was written in 1976-77, it was a very strange and difficult time for him. He described it to me as being a very depressing time, which you might find surprising because he was now at a considerable level of success in terms of his career as a writer. He obviously published Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, and then The Stand. So he found himself in that difficult position of not being able to find traction for the next book, not being able to really find the kind of book that was going to capture his imagination. There was something inside him that felt that he had more to prove, that he needed to write a book that was a more realistic novel, and that would soon become The Dead Zone. And midway through the writing of that book, found himself stonewalled again. So he turned to subject matter that was very familiar to him, and that was Firestarter. And then midway through that book, he had another realization that now he was writing a horror novel again. So he went back to The Dead Zone with even greater ambition, and I think as a result wrote one of his best novels.
Pretty good, huh?
The Dead Zone was a phenomenal success, but also a phenomenal eye-opening experience for the reviewers, critics, the literary establishment.
There were 5 scripts that had already been written, attempts to make the movie. And I felt that Jeffrey Boehm's script was the one that felt the most close to me, to the tone of the book. Now, it was in making The Dead Zone that I came up with my mantra, which is, in order to be faithful to the book, you have to betray the book. Because there's no direct translation that you can do of a novel. The two media are very different. And Jeffrey had somehow caught that kind of lonely, wintry, isolated New England tone that Stephen King is very famous for.
Each of us has gone to the movies to see an adaptation of one of our favorite books, and we felt it's been ruined. Occasionally we go, and we're very happy with the results. And Jeffrey Boehm, certainly, with David Cronenberg in The Dead Zone, did a terrific job of taking a very detailed book, one that had an enormous number of subplots, a lot of depth, a lot of characterization, all those things which are often just alien to motion pictures, and bringing them to the screen.
I was always attracted to characters who are on the margins of society, who are even grotesque, who are pushed out of society, and who are eccentric and strange and difficult. And here was someone who was meant, by the giving of this very common name, was meant to be an everyman. So it's a complete reversal of what I had done before. That's where the strength of the novel is. That's where the strength of Stephen King's finger on the pulse of the common man in America in particular. Of course, I suppose ironically, Johnny Smith does become like one of my outsiders. He begins as a sort of everyman and becomes a kind of a monster, a creature, who feels that he can no longer function in society and really isolates himself and pushes himself to the margins. But there's an incredible sadness to him because he wanted very much to be a normal person. He didn't want to be this creature that he had become.
I'm scared, Sam. What's happening to me?
I think there's no doubt that the character of Johnny Smith is very much a part of Stephen King. And in fact, that what happens to Johnny Smith in this book is something that in a way happened to Stephen King. Steve was caught up in this great success that resulted from his early book. And with that came a loss of other things, a loss of time away from your family, away from your ordinary life, away from those things that a lot of us consider to be mundane. All those things were, to an extent, lost to him in a way that was very similar to what happened to Johnny Smith, who had lost years of his life.
When I woke up, my girl was gone, my job was gone, my legs are just about useless. Bless me. God's been a real sport to me.
The casting of your lead character is always absolutely critical. And The Dead Zone in particular, of course, because the way that I conceived it is so formed around this one character. Then you are inside his head more than you are often in other movies. So it was absolutely vital that you had a man who could do all these things, who could be a normal person and then could be a kind of a freak, and that he could be romantic too, because the bittersweet aspect of his lost love is really the driving force.
I'll just say goodnight.
There were several actors that we considered. But what you want is that when you've chosen the actor, you want him to be so perfect in the role that nobody can therefore think of anybody else playing that role. I think Chris did that.
What am I gonna do? For you, 5 years have come and gone. For me, it's just about the next day.
Everybody's talking about you. You're the talk of the town.
The first time I ever read a Stephen King book, it was The Dead Zone, and it was before I knew anything about the movie. And of course, I loved the book and I loved the character. She's so kind of the central reason for everything.
Brooke Adams, I had seen her in the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I had seen her in quite a few movies. And she just had that beautiful small-town America look, but with a lot of genuineness and innocence and a beautiful sexuality that was just very subtle and lovely, and a wonderful smile, and incredibly easy access to her emotion.
Hello, Johnny.
Chris Walken, who I did a play with him called The Philanderer, and he was going into meetings with David Cronenberg and Deborah Hill in New York, and they were saying, we're talking about different people for the movie, and he said, how about Brooke? Brooke who, I imagine they said. Anyway, no, he got me the job, basically, which was lovely of him to do. Doesn't happen very much. I knew Chris when he was Ronnie Walken. My sister was in the same class as his brother at school, so I knew him, and I knew his family. We used to go out to his parents' house in Queens. Ronnie, he'd go out and do dance numbers and stuff. So I have a huge soft spot for him as just a childhood friend. He's dangerous. He just walks to the edge and then looks like he's going to fall off and doesn't somehow.
Johnny, wait!
As I remember, Chris did, I think, 3 performances of everything throughout all the takes of all the scenes. I think you could say 3 levels of performance, and trusted us to shape that. So when you have an actor that's willing to do that, willing to give you a range of performance and not be afraid of what the director and the editor are going to do with it, it does give you enormous alternatives.
Hi.
Working with him in films, he always knew which takes he liked better, always knew when to retake a line. He'd say that again to me, and he'd do it again.
You can really shape the arc of the performance. It's real film acting, it's giving a lot of trust, because you can't do a whole performance. You can't control your performance. You can't control what the people are going to do to you afterwards, and Chris was willing to do that. And he's very quirky. I liked working with him very much because he gave us a lot of material. But a lot of it was the way he can express emotion without saying the lines.
Most actors can't really be that removed and analytical about their work. I can't watch myself on film at all. He kept saying, you really ought to try it. So he's more than an actor. He's really got a whole eye on the whole piece and what it needs to be.
David's worked with a lot of really good actors before The Dead Zone, but maybe not so many in one place, so many in one picture. And they were good. They were excellent.
Every role should be, when I'm focusing on it, to cast it, is as though it is the lead role. The Dead Zone was the first movie I had done that was not a sort of a Canadian movie. So I could get actors like Anthony Zerbe and Martin Sheen.
We've been winning ever since, and those people spent that money with a clear conscience.
Tom Skerritt was another coup. Wonderful voice, wonderful tone, very intelligent and aware. Herbert Lom is an actor that I had seen in many, many movies, mostly English. He'd done a lot of comedies and, of course, was very famous for being the Clouseau's boss in the Pink Panther movies. But I knew him as a serious actor. And Herbert also, wonderful, wonderful voice. When I have Canadian actors in the movie, like Nicholas Campbell, like Jackie Burroughs, like Colleen Dewhurst, they're there because I think they're the best for the role, not just because I have to use Canadians. So I had the best of both possible worlds in this movie in terms of actors.
Lost for 5 years, and now reborn unto me.
That's what I remember, is just that he was very willing to give you whatever it was you needed without telling you a great deal about what he wanted. I remember I would come out of my trailer and we'd meet and we'd be freezing cold and we'd go, okay, ready for this? And we'd go in and do it.
I often dream about my actors, and I wake up when I'm thinking of casting them. I become very emotionally involved with them at a distance in a way they don't even know about. And so it was very exciting for me to be able to get, let's say, Anthony Zerbe to play a minor role, but so important, such an important role. And so it was very interesting. He came up and he said to me, after our first day of shooting, he said, you know, I just came up here because it's a gig, the money was good, but when I got here, I realized, man, these guys are taking this very seriously. And he said, everybody's trying really hard on this movie. And so I realized I had to up my game, and I have to be good too. And I said, yes, you have to.
The ice is gonna break!
Stilson, I've often thought his name was derived as a combination of Still and Nixon, which I think is part of the perspective that Steve King was applying then in the 1970s, where we had just suffered through the end game of the Nixon presidency at about the time that he was writing the book, and had gone through another cycle of corruption, power, lies, all those things that we associate now all too frequently with politics.
The visions did get longer as the film progressed. They were flashes, obviously, at the beginning, until when the theme was bigger, with Stilson, the presidential candidate. It was a whole scene.
The lead character, Chris Walken, he has this psychic power to see into the future. And when I meet him at a campaign rally, he shakes my hand, and with the contact, he gets a vision of the future. And that's where this incident takes place, in the future, where I've become President of the United States, and I decide to push the button and start World War III and end the world, literally.
My destiny.
Of course, the movie is very subversive in a way because you can see it as an apology for political assassination. And if you really look at it from a distance, both the book and the movie are suggesting that under certain circumstances, assassination is justified, that a man alone, based on his visions, could be justified in assassinating a successful politician. And that's a fairly heavy thing to suggest, and it means, once again, for it to work in the movie, that we have to believe that what Johnny sees is true. That's another reason that I wanted to see it from his point of view, because I wanted the audience to feel that it was justified, and then when the movie was over, to say, wow, I really wanted him to shoot this man, but I wanted the audience to be complicit in the assassination attempt. And of course, he needed an opponent who was also grandiose, and that was, of course, the Martin Sheen character, Stilson, a man who is a rabble-rouser and a dangerous politician. But speaking of Martin Sheen's performances, Greg Stilson, I will defend that as not being over the top.
Now you put your goddamn hand on that scanning screen, or I'll hack it off and put it on for you.
Not being a caricature or a cartoon, but as being accurate in terms of the way certain politicians present themselves. I think Stilson is a credible character. Unfortunately, he is not a cartoon who is too absurd to be real. He is very real.
And most importantly, I need your money. God bless, Roger. I'll be seeing you.
Well, you have only to wake up of a given morning and pick up a newspaper, and you have to wonder what kind of world we're living in. We're a drug culture. We've got a higher percent of divorce than any country in the world. We have interests in every conceivable part of the world. We're so spread thin, and yet we're asked to live normal lives under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Everybody on the globe. So you have to wonder what is sane and what is not sane. I think you have to have a connection with a far more important reality than what's going on here. You have to find in other people that quality which you best seek in yourself, the very best in you. Not project the worst on others and expect the worst. You have to really expect the best, because times are so anxiety-ridden and so precarious that maintaining one's sanity can be a day-to-day job. I've often felt that acting was above all good therapy, because it gives the actor a license, as it were, to deal in areas that ordinarily he would be arrested for. So I think that in large measure it's the creativity that's thwarted that causes serious problems in the society.
The question was, what did Greg Stilson do to end his career? What happened? He had to do some really terrible, obviously cowardly thing to end his career. Because Johnny doesn't shoot him, he escapes. Johnny instead gets shot, but somehow Stilson's career is going to be over. And of course, he commits suicide. We see that in the future he will commit suicide. What makes him do that? What he did was he grabbed a baby and held it up to protect himself so that he wouldn't get shot. Something that if it did appear on the cover of Newsweek, as you see in Johnny's flash forward to the future, would end a politician's career.
In the original novel, it was just a child from the audience. You know, he grabbed someone, whoever was handy. In the motion picture, the child is actually the child, of course, of John Smith's beloved. And it makes the scene even more powerful.
I thought, well, of course she has to be there at the finale, and why not bring her baby? And so we had to hustle around and find this baby. And like the first baby, this baby was kind of cranky. So the baby is always crying.
Just a side note, the kid who takes the photographs is the only member of the Sheen family who hasn't been an actor. He was there visiting his dad, Martin Sheen, and David said, here, you take the pictures. So he takes the Newsweek photo. When Martin Sheen's character, Greg Stilson, is prevented from winning the primary, we had a two-walled motel room. It was just him on a bed with a night table, and I think we just put black fabric in the background and kept it very stark. Put the gun under his chin, cut to the Newsweek, and David had a handful of blood and splashed it on.
Now, in the novel, the closure that Sarah receives is different in its depiction, although the same emotionally, and she has a closure through a scene where she goes to visit John Smith's grave, and she suddenly feels a touch on her shoulder, but there's no one there, and she realizes in her heart, or at least believes, that it's Johnny, and says to herself, same old Johnny.
Goodbye.
The ending was a big set piece, and it went from pretty wide things to basically a love story between the two of them, or the return of the love story, the resolution of the love story. It was quite small, and it was personal, and it ended that way. There was an alternative, at least one alternative ending, that would possibly have tidied up a few things for the audience, which ultimately we didn't think was necessary.
With The Dead Zone, I think there was the feeling that there should be some coda to it, some denouement, something that took the pressure off the audience, the emotional pressure off the audience, so that you'd have a bit of a chance to breathe, to see Sarah, what her life was like afterwards, that she, of course, had recovered from his death, that she has her baby. But it just seemed to diminish the movie by doing that, rather than enhancing it, by making it fuller. The power of that moment, it was as though it just felt like that was where the movie should end.
David has an ability to hold back everyone's emotions and then grab you by a particular organ you hadn't thought of. In this case, I think it was the first time he'd reached for the heart rather than the throat.
One of the interesting things about the combination of Stephen King and David Cronenberg in The Dead Zone is that it's not really a horror movie. But that combination was delivering something else. And it's interesting because the visuals of the film are very much attuned to that, and the music is very much attuned to that. Michael Kamen's score is a very idyllic score. It's a brilliant background score for that particular film, and it never once indulges those kinds of tropes that we tend to hear in horror film scores. Instead, it very much stands on its own and serves as an emotional backdrop for the visuals that Cronenberg delivers.
You're finished. I had done every original score up to that point with Howard Shore, but there were reasons why he could not do the score for The Dead Zone. I wanted him to. There were scheduling problems, but the suggestion was that we use Michael Kamen. And I met Michael, and I loved him immediately. It was a wonderful experience. Michael really understood that loneliness, that emotion, the sadness, the bittersweetness of the movie.
Can teachers be expelled for kissing in the hallway?
They get fired.
Thank God it's Friday.
Of course, he's a fine composer, but I think everybody relaxed a bit when they heard the score because it worked really well, and it was very atmospheric.
And he really reflected that beautifully in the score that he did, also very orchestral. So it was really, ultimately, it was not a disaster on any level, but really a wonderful experience.
I think a lot of people came to that film wondering, what is David Cronenberg going to do to The Dead Zone to make it his own? He took a very subdued approach, I thought. It has that kind of clinical, cold feeling that his films sometimes have, a detached observation that I think is a good thing because we don't get drawn in so much to sort of the pathos of Johnny Smith's situation. We're seeing it with a bit more perspective and a bit more uncertainty. Even though we feel very strongly for him, we still have that distance that we're able to assess what's going on, why it's happening.
Dear Sarah, this is a hard letter to write, so I'll try to make it short.
Well, I didn't make that many movies, so they all sort of stand out. But this one I really, really did like, and I love Chris. And I thought, oh, good, they're going to do something nice with the film on DVD, and I liked the idea. I think the film holds up. I've gotten over the years a lot of fan mail, and they always mention Dead Zone, so I think it's nice.
The Dead Zone is really the past, is everything that John Smith has lost in his coma, those years that have gone by. And finally, the book itself talks about the Dead Zone really as being the world of the dead, that place where memories go, memories of people who we loved, who now passed on. They're now sort of in this dead zone where they're still alive, but in our memories.
In a way, The Dead Zone, the movie, is a dead zone for me because Deborah Hill has died, Jeffrey Boehm has died, Michael Kamen, several of the actors, several members of the crew, all died young. So it's a kind of a sad thing, in a way, for me to watch the movie again, remembering all these people who are gone now. But it is in keeping with the tone of the movie, which, as I said, is basically about loss.
Goodbye.
I love you.
We have no new leads this time. However, there is always the hope that some citizen, perhaps in the audience right now, might have some information.
The Dead Zone introduced the town of Castle Rock on a large canvas. Castle Rock became Stephen King's hometown for many years, the location of so many of his novels and his short fiction. Castle Rock, of course, is a completely fictitious town. It's made up of a lot of different locations in Maine that are near and dear to Steve King.
Your daughter's screaming. Amy's screaming. It's not too late. Hurry up!
A lot of horror films are dark and brooding in every single scene. So this film was a release from that. It was snow-covered, very bleak, very Spartan, and the tragic journey of Johnny Smith.
As is often the case, Canada stood in for America. And I love to shoot in Toronto and in Ontario, which is my province. And it's very close to New England in terms of the feel of the weather and the architecture. And we found several small towns and farmhouses and so on that we shot in, which I love because they're very Ontario to me, but they also work very well for being America. And we were very lucky with the weather because it was a sort of a mild winter that then became quite vicious. So we had 3.5 seasons, even though we were technically shooting in the winter. And that worked very well for the movie. And in particular, the gazebo scene. You can hear the crunching of the snow, that you only get that when not only do you have snow, but it's fiercely cold. I mean, I've never been colder shooting a scene.
Yeah, I know this girl.
The night scenes in the gazebo, and the day scenes for that matter, we had a lot of snow and a lot of cold temperature. I think we had 3 or 4 weeks of nights, and it was easily in centigrade 30 to 40 below, and windy.
We were shooting in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is on Lake Ontario, in that town. They didn't have a gazebo, and the script demanded a gazebo, and I liked that idea. But before we could build it, we had to get permission from the town. And they didn't like the idea of the gazebo. It's not original and blah, blah, blah. We said, look, in movies, you don't build things to last. We'll build it superficially. So we built the gazebo, we shot the scene. We expected them to take it down. Now, suddenly, I get a pamphlet advertising Niagara-on-the-Lake, and right on the front page of the pamphlet is our gazebo. Suddenly, it's now part of the history of the town. If you're looking for a fantasy version of America, especially one that has a nostalgia for the past and has a bit of the feel of the 50s, I immediately think of Norman Rockwell, because not only was he a fine artist, he also was a very popular artist, and we used him as our touchstone for the look of the film, even to the extent that the political poster of Stilson was done in a Norman Rockwell style very deliberately. And that's not just an art direction, because Stilson himself, as a character, would know that he was appealing to that past of America.
We think the killer hid around the corner just out the end of the tunnel there.
Every once in a while, you come to a location or a moment in a movie where the visual aspect does become the controlling imperative. And when I found this tunnel, we realized because it was so cold, we could spray the tunnel with water, which would freeze, and then it would make all of the stone reflective. And so that was one case where the choreography of the scene had to bow down to the tunnel. Everything was based around the tunnel and using the tunnel to tell that particular story. And it has great symbolic force. A tunnel, of course, in normal psychiatry or legend, tunnels have great import. It has to do with traveling into unknown territory, taking you underground. There's a sense of claustrophobia. And then the sound can echo. We have a kind of strange, almost spirit voices, because everybody's voice is going to echo in this chamber.
Yeah, this is Vanderman.
We got another body here, Sheriff.
So it was a very spooky, beautiful place to shoot. And yes, I had heard that it was haunted.
The tunnel that portrayed in the Dead Zone is actually underneath the railway line, and this tunnel was apparently haunted by the death of a slave child. It was called the Screaming Tunnel by the locals. Okay, well, we're going to shoot there all night. Nonetheless, it was a very simple shot. However, it was a haunted tunnel. The generator failed, everything froze, the dolly froze to the tracks. We had to borrow power from a farmhouse across the road. It was a night that we almost didn't get.
One of the things that sets The Dead Zone apart as a terrific adaptation is Cronenberg's ability, working with Jeffrey Baum, I think, to deliver so much of the novel in this exquisite shorthand. The scene where it's revealed that Frank Dodd is the killer and that leads to his death is the first time we really go inside the life of Frank Dodd.
There are many ways that you can deliver a character's past. In a novel, of course, there's the interior monologue of the novel, which you can't really do very well in a movie. And then there's a psychiatrist telling you things, and in this movie that would have felt really quite like the wrong way to deliver the past of this man, Dodd, the serial killer, who is also a policeman, so he's very schizophrenic in his life. But there are other ways you can tell the audience about his past while you're still involved in the narrative, which does not have to stop. It's his wallpaper, for example. He has the wallpaper of a boy. You know, it's cowboys and Indians. So that immediately tells you that he's living some kind of infantilized, regressive inability to grow up, some strange connection with his past. And when you add the mother at the door, who you can see immediately as a gorgon, she's a dragon, incredibly strong, incredibly fearsome, incredibly intense, and kind of a perverse way. You can immediately tell just from the way she answers the door a lot about her son, who still lives with her.
Talk to your son, Mrs. Dodd.
He ain't here.
You get all of this from the design of the house, from the casting of Colleen Dewhurst as his mother, and of course from Nick's face. When you're preparing a movie and you're discussing the design of the movie, production design, and that includes lighting, but it also includes wardrobe. So we took our cue from not only the somberness of the movie, with some exceptions, like Brooke Adams' sweater when she comes to visit Johnny, obviously to make love with him, and her sweater is red. So there's symbolism at some points. For example, in Dodd's mother's house, there's some strange green light. We don't know why there's green light there, but it's an emotional thing because we know that there's something sickly and perverse and not healthy.
You leave my boy alone.
You knew. So there are many ways you can deliver characters and tones in the movie, but it means paying attention to everything, actually. For example, I was aware that in some scenes his collar is up, and it's like wings, it's like a crow, it's like some omen of evil. It also gives him a kind of messianic prophet look without it being unnatural, but it does give him a kind of a Dracula-like look. I was aware of it at the time. I wasn't really, of course, wanting to make him be Dracula, and yet, in a way, it works because it's expressionistic. Definitely, it stresses the idea that he's almost not human. There's a non-human aspect to him, which he himself, Johnny, feels, which is why he has absented himself from human society. He feels that he cannot be in human society because of what he's become, which is in some ways not human.
I stood there and watched him kill that fellow.
What are you talking about?
I did nothing.
A movie, however you plan it, the reality of the movie takes over. It becomes like a living thing, an organic thing. You want that. You don't want it to be a mechanical thing that fits together with all the pieces clicking in like a jigsaw puzzle and it's perfect. It fights you. So the things that you think will work sometimes do and sometimes do not. And so you struggle with that on the set and then finally in the editing and in the sound mix. And all of these things combine to make a kind of organic whole that surprises you. I mean, for me as a filmmaker, I want to be surprised.
No, wait!
I've always seen David as there are 12 kids down at the beach and they're all picking up rocks and throwing them, skipping stones or splashing them. The 11 of them are doing that. The 12th one is David, and he's picking up the stones and looking underneath them to see what creepy crawly things are there. That's what fascinates him, and I think translating that to real life, he sees somebody walking and talking and life goes on, but what's inside this person? Who has come out of a coma? Why do they see things differently?
Thank you.
The dead zone in the book partly was a medical condition brought about by a brain tumor, and it had to do with those parts of the future that he really couldn't see, he couldn't anticipate. What I did was have a moment where the doctor, played by Herbert Lom, says,
"Not only can you see the future, you can change it. That is your dead zone."
So there's that shift there, because you see the future, you change something in the present, it changes the future. What does that do to your vision? Well, it invalidates your vision. Suddenly your vision of the future is inaccurate. And so that was the dead zone of uncertainty.
The key with Christopher was to get this jolt, and when he touched someone's hand, it wasn't enough to just assume there'd be creepy music or a high point emotionally. He wanted to physically jolt himself.
up.
In a certain very real sense, the director is there to give the actor whatever he needs to play the role to its fullest. And Chris, for the moments where he has these visions, which are painful and sharp, and asked me to fire off a .44 Magnum pistol without telling him when I was going to do it, when we were shooting those scenes, in particular the close-ups, where he has these sudden flashes of the future that come to him. And so I spent a lot of that movie with a gun in my hand, which is not my style, I have to say, but certainly it was in making of The Dead Zone that I actually had to learn quite a lot about guns. And finally found myself actually firing off an Uzi submachine gun and then an AK-47 assault rifle in order to get reactions from the extras when Johnny's about to shoot Stilson and everybody scatters. Of course they were blanks.
There was the initial prologue, I believe, and my recollection is that Johnny Smith as a child has been skating on the ice and has a premonition that something is going to happen to someone who's about to jumpstart his car. He clips the cables inverse polarity and it explodes, and he's covered in battery acid and all these terrible things. And so this is the inkling that Johnny had something other than just growing up on his mind.
And I do believe that that's in the book as well. And we did shoot that. We shot all of that. And I felt it was better not to know Johnny as a child and to have another actor playing him as a child. I really felt his presence as an adult was enough to shift between before his accident and after. And so I was sure that the movie had to be played from Johnny's point of view. And so I came up with the idea of having Johnny be present in his own visions, that the visions should come right into his life as solidly as everybody sitting here, and then disappear again. And so the audience would feel the reality of the visions that Johnny felt. The visions had to be very compelling for the movie to work. There had to be no doubt that they had some kind of reality to Johnny. Going along with my idea that Johnny should actually be in his own visions, we decided to try to find a way to have him be in the little girl's burning bedroom. He is in a bed, after all, in the hospital, and it would be a very straightforward transition with cutting to have him be in this little girl's bedroom. He sees that this girl's house is on fire and that she's trapped in her bedroom.
We ended up constructing a set, a very elaborate set with drywall and steel and all sorts of things, so the fire wouldn't go past the structure that we had built. There were all kinds of fireman safety things, but what no one realized at the time was that all the toys that were on fire, one of them was an E.T. doll, which meant, uh-oh, so we had to reshoot all of that and burn something that was much more anonymous.
This was before the days of CGI. There was no computer stuff going on at all. Chris was very willing to sit in a bed that we set on fire, basically, although there was a hole in the bed and he was actually well underneath it, and it was not his legs or his body that we set on fire in the bed, but he really was in a burning room. And he had an escape hatch that he could go right out under the bed. We had to build up the stage so that he could slip out from underneath.
If you look closely at Christopher Walken in the bed, he appears to be perspiring, but he was coated in something called Zell gel, created by an effects guy out of New York called Gary Zeller, who did all the effects on scanners. And this is the common thing now when people are doing burn scenes. They will cover themselves with this fluid gel, which will last maybe 3 minutes until it itself evaporates. But it added to the scene.
And in that first vision, sets it up incredibly well, that what the visions feel like to him, they're terrifying to him and forceful because he's in them. He almost feels as though he's in danger. And yet, as he says later in the gazebo scene,
I stood there. I did nothing.
If he stayed there, he would see this little girl catch fire and burn to death without being able to do a thing to stop it, even though he feels his presence in the room, but he isn't really present, of course. And so that really set the stage for our understanding of what his visions were and why they were so draining. Because another thing that I added to the sort of concept of the visions was that they were exhausting him, really draining his life force, as the Herbert Loam character says.
As the spells, the visions grow stronger and more powerful, so the body weakens.
Imagine living like that at any moment, without any anticipation, you could suddenly be plunged into a vision of some disaster that emotionally involves you, but prevents you from doing anything about it. I think everybody was actually pretty excited about the World War II vision. And I think the way that I had originally thought of it was that right in the clinic, as he's having this vision holding Vizek's hand, a tank should come right through the wall of the clinic and almost run them over. And that would be our intro into the vision. And it seemed that the mechanics of this, I thought, were going to get very awkward and very forced, very mechanical. And so ultimately we dropped that idea.
When we talk about The Dead Zone as a David Cronenberg film, I think that the one Cronenberg scene that everyone remembers, and it's just purely Cronenberg, is the death of Frank Dodd. In the book, he slits his throat. In Cronenberg's adaptation, we have this brilliant, crazed scene of Frank Dodd driving himself into this pair of scissors in this very ritualistic act, in this very bizarre bathroom setting. And it's pure Cronenberg, but it's also pure genius because that's the visual aesthetic.
Somehow I arrived at the idea of Dodd using scissors, sort of barber scissors, which are very nasty and very sharp and have a very distinct look, as a weapon that he would use to murder his victims. It just seemed eccentric, and in the novel it might be a straight razor, but every murderer is unique, of course, and I didn't want to play him just as, I say, a modular murder. And I wanted him to be very specific without actually getting into why the scissors would have significance to him. Did his mother cut his hair as a youth with him, and somehow he connected that with her sexuality and her sensuality as she touches him? We don't know. I'm making that up right on the spot right now, but it works. And so I connect those scissors with his mother, and therefore I wanted him to kill himself with the scissors in a very painful way, as though he's punishing himself, and so he does.
Impaling himself on a pair of barber scissors in his mouth was a pretty horrific image. And then when we're doing horrific images in the cutting room, it's usually with a great deal of delight, and we enjoy it. We usually ask people in and don't tell them what we're going to show them and see how they react. We just enjoy it a lot in a very slightly perverse manner, perhaps.
You leave my boy alone.
And the fact that this monster of a mother is still capable herself of killing, that she tries to kill Johnny because she knows that he's a danger to her son, tells you even more about where that boy came from and why he grew up the way he did.
It's the tipping point of the film. In other words, it builds to this place that's pure horror, and things are going to get worse. Now we're going to take this whole story to the other place that it's going, which is about this horrible decision that John Smith has to make. And the question of whether, if you're put in this situation, need to or have to pull the trigger to end something you think is going to happen.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Secretary, the missiles are flying.